Imagine spending your entire career facing down the worst criminals in the city, drug dealers, gang members, even killers, only to discover your most formidable opponent would be a middle-aged woman named Diane, wielding nothing but a clipboard and a rulebook. That's exactly what happened to me, Michael Reeves, when I moved into Oak Ridge Estates and crossed paths with the most ruthless HOA president I've ever encountered. This is the story of how she towed my unmarked police vehicle and accidentally declared war on the wrong resident. Before we dive into this wild ride, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below telling me your city and if you've ever had your own HOA nightmare. After 12 years living in a cramped apartment near the precinct, I'd finally saved enough for a down payment on my first home. Nothing fancy, just a modest 3-bedroom with a small yard in a quiet development called Oak Ridge Estates, the kind of place where you could actually see stars at night and didn't have to fight for parking. Moving day was everything I'd dreamed about, carrying my belongings through the front door of a house that was actually mine. No more shared walls. No more upstairs neighbors doing jumping jacks at midnight. And finally a driveway where I could park without circling the block for 20 minutes. "Officer Reeves, need any help with those boxes?" My new neighbor Tom called from across the street, walking over with a friendly wave. "Just Michael is fine when I'm off duty," I replied, setting down a box of kitchen supplies. "And I think I've got it, but thanks for the offer." Tom glanced around nervously before lowering his voice. "Listen, before you get too settled, there's something you should know about Oak Ridge." I raised an eyebrow, wondering if he was about to tell me about some local crime issue I should be aware of. After 8 years working narcotics, I developed a sixth sense for trouble. "It's the HOA," he continued, "specifically Diane Hartwell, the president. She's intense." I chuckled, thinking about all the dangerous situations I'd navigated throughout my career. "I appreciate the warning, but I've dealt with plenty of difficult people in my line of work." Tom shook his head. "Not like Diane. Just make sure everything's exactly up to code. She doesn't know you're a cop, right?" "No reason she would. I drive an unmarked car for work, and I don't advertise my profession to everyone I meet." "Keep it that way as long as you can," Tom advised cryptically before heading back to his house. I dismissed his warning as neighborhood drama and continued unpacking. The house needed work, some fresh paint, new fixtures, maybe updated landscaping. Eventually, but it was mine. After years of saving every penny and working overtime, I finally had my own piece of the American dream. That evening, I parked my unmarked police Dodge Charger in the driveway, admiring how right it looked sitting there. Nothing flashy about it, just a standard black sedan with tinted windows. To the casual observer, it was completely unremarkable. Perfect for my undercover narcotics work, and perfectly within HOA regulations about resident vehicles, or so I thought. I spent that first weekend settling in, arranging furniture, hanging pictures, and reviewing the HOA guidelines that had come with my closing paperwork. The rulebook was thick, filled with regulations about everything from acceptable paint colors to proper mailbox height. It seemed excessive, but I understood the purpose, maintaining neighborhood standards and property values. I'd played by the rules my entire life. Following protocol was second nature after years on the force. These HOA regulations would be no different. I'd comply with the reasonable requests and handle any issues professionally. What I didn't realize as I drifted off to sleep that first night in my new home was that Diane Hartwell didn't operate on reason or professionalism. She ruled Oak Ridge, estates like her personal fiefdom, and she'd already noticed the suspicious vehicle in my driveway. I couldn't have known that my unmarked police car, the same vehicle I used to protect the city, would become the first battleground in a neighborhood where I never wanted to fight. As I dozed off that night, comfortable in my new home, Diane was already drafting her first warning letter, taking careful note of my license plate number and adding my address to her problem residents list. The next morning, I headed off to the precinct for an early shift, blissfully unaware that the most challenging case of my career wouldn't involve drugs, gangs, or organized crime, but instead a suburban tyrant armed with bylaws, a personal vendetta, and absolutely no idea that she was about to pick a fight with the wrong homeowner. The first few days in my new home passed in peaceful bliss. After years of sirens and traffic noise outside my apartment window, the quiet of Oak Ridge Estates felt almost surreal. I spent my free time unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and starting to make the place truly mine. On my third morning, I was watering the somewhat neglected flower beds when I spotted her for the first time. A woman in pressed khaki pants and a polo shirt, with Oak Ridge Estates HOA embroidered on the chest, was making her way down the street, clipboard in hand. She moved with purpose, stopping at each house, making notes, occasionally taking photos with her phone. Even from a distance, I could see how some neighbors quickly retreated inside when they noticed her approach. This had to be Diane. I continued watering my plants, determined to make a positive first impression. As she drew closer, I noticed her. Critical gaze sweeping across my property, lingering on the patchy areas of my lawn and the peeling trim around my garage door, both on my list of weekend projects. "Good morning," I called out pleasantly as she reached the edge of my driveway. She looked up from her clipboard, eyes narrowing slightly as she assessed me. "You must be the new owner. I'm Diane Hartwell, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." Her tone carried all the warmth of a parking ticket. "Michael Reeves," I replied, walking over to extend my hand. "Nice to meet you." She gave my hand a brief, limp shake before returning to her clipboard. "Mr. Reeves, I see you're attempting to address the landscaping situation. The previous owners let things deteriorate considerably." "Yes, I've got several projects planned, just taking it one step at a time." Diane made a small sound, clearly unimpressed. "Our community standards require all visible landscaping to be properly maintained at all times. That includes addressing brown patch in lawns within 7 days of appearance." I kept my expression neutral despite the absurdity. "I just moved 3 days ago, but I've got soil treatment and grass seed ready to go this weekend." "See that you do." "Also," she continued, glancing toward my garage, "the trim paint is non-compliant. It needs to be repainted in an approved color." "Already on my list," I assured her. "I've reviewed the HOA guidelines and have the approved paint chip for when I tackle that project." She seemed momentarily taken aback by my preparedness, but quickly recovered. Her gaze drifted to my driveway where my unmarked police charger was parked. "That vehicle," she said, her voice taking on a different tone. "We have strict regulations about what can be parked in driveways." "I've read them," I replied calmly. "Personal vehicles are permitted in private driveways. Commercial vehicles, RVs and boats require garage storage or off-site parking." "Yes, but that car—" She paused, studying it more carefully. "It seems unusual. The windows are quite dark." I maintained my friendly demeanor. "It's just a standard sedan with factory tinting. Well, within legal limits, completely compliant with both state law and HOA regulations." Diane's lips pressed into a thin line. I could almost see the wheels turning as she searched for some violation to cite. Finding none immediately obvious, she made a note on her clipboard. "We'll see about that," she muttered, not quite under her breath. "The board takes vehicle violations very seriously, Mr. Reeves." "I'm sure they do. Thankfully, my car doesn't violate any guidelines." Our eyes locked in a brief standoff before she switched tactics. "Your mailbox is leaning approximately 3 degrees to the left. Please correct that immediately." Without waiting for my response, she turned and continued her patrol down the street. I watched her go, remembering Tom's warning with new understanding. This wasn't just neighborhood drama. Diane Hartwell was exactly as advertised. That evening, returning from my shift, I found an official-looking envelope tucked into my front door. Inside was a friendly reminder regarding vehicle compliance standards. The notice claimed that unusual or suspicious vehicles must be stored in garages or off-property and cited a bylaw number. I immediately pulled up the complete HOA guidelines on my laptop and checked the reference section. As I suspected, no such wording existed. The actual bylaw only restricted commercial vehicles with visible business markings, oversized trucks, and non-operational vehicles. My unmarked Charger violated none of these standards. The next morning, I straightened my mailbox with a level, treated the brown patches in my lawn, and began scraping the old paint from my garage trim. No sense giving Diane legitimate ammunition. Throughout the day, I noticed her black Mercedes making slow passes by my house. On her third drive-by, I waved pleasantly. She didn't wave back. By the end of the week, 2 more notices had appeared, one claiming my trash bins had remained at the curb too long, they hadn't, and another citing concerns about after-hours activity due to my late arrivals home some nights. I filed each notice in a new folder labeled HOA correspondence and continued with my home improvements. Years of police work had taught me the value of documentation and patience. The following Tuesday, arriving home after an extended shift, I found my neighbor Tom in his driveway washing his car. "I see you've met the dragon lady," he called over, nodding toward a fresh notice tucked into my door. "She's certainly attentive," I replied diplomatically. Tom laughed without humor. "That's one way to put it. Word is she's particularly interested. In your car. Claims it looks suspicious at the last board meeting. My completely ordinary regulation-compliant sedan." I raised an eyebrow. "Diane doesn't need actual violations," Tom explained, lowering his voice. "She creates them when necessary. Been doing it for years." I retrieved the latest notice, another warning about my vehicle, this time claiming the tinted windows created security concerns for the neighborhood. As I read the increasingly absurd allegations, I felt my professional interest peak. After years investigating actual criminals, I recognized the hallmarks of someone drunk on petty power. Diane exhibited the same patterns of escalation I'd seen in cases of harassment. "Has anyone ever challenged her?" I asked Tom. His expression darkened. "A few tried. They either gave up and moved, or suddenly found themselves drowning in violation. Notices and fines. She's got the board wrapped around her finger." I nodded, understanding the dynamics at play. "Interesting." Tom gave me a curious look. "You don't seem particularly worried." I smiled slightly, thinking of the countless intimidation tactics I'd faced down over my career. Let's just say I've dealt with worse than clipboard warriors. As I headed inside with my latest violation notice, I didn't yet realize how quickly this neighborhood nuisance would escalate into something far more serious. In my line of work, I'd learned that people who abuse power rarely know when to stop, and Diane Hartwell had no idea who she was really dealing with. 2 weeks into my residency at Oak Ridge Estates, my work schedule intensified dramatically. Our narcotics unit had been tracking a major distribution ring for months, and we finally had actionable intelligence. This meant long hours, unpredictable shifts, and often returning home well after midnight. The operation consumed my attention, leaving little mental space for HOA drama. Each night I'd arrive home exhausted, sometimes sitting in my car for a few minutes just to decompress before heading inside. The quiet darkness of my driveway became a brief sanctuary between the intensity of work and sleep. That is, until the floodlights began. The first time it happened, I was pulling in around 1:30 a.m. after a particularly grueling surveillance shift. As my headlights swept across my driveway, motion sensors triggered blindingly bright security lights from Diane's house, directly aimed at my property. The sudden illumination was jarring, turning night to day in an instant. Through my side window, I could see Diane's silhouette watching from behind her curtains. The next morning, another notice awaited me. Violation, excessive noise and disturbance, late-night arrivals creating neighborhood disruption. I added it to my growing collection of baseless complaints. 3 more appeared over the next week, each more strongly worded than the last. The latest one threatened specific fines and further action if the suspicious vehicle continued to be parked in my driveway, especially during non-standard hours. When I checked my mailbox that Friday, I found an official-looking envelope containing an actual fine of $150 for repeated violations and failure to comply with HOA directives. The letter warned that unpaid fines would result in liens against my property. This was no longer merely annoying, it was becoming harassment. I decided to try resolving things through proper channels before escalating. I drafted a polite but firm email to the entire HOA board, addressing each false violation with references to the actual bylaws, requesting clarification on the unfounded fine, and expressing my desire to be a cooperative community member. The Chiu. Response came within hours. Not from the board, but from Diane herself. Mr. Reeves, all communications to the board must be directed through the president. Your concerns have been noted, but the violations stand. Payment is expected within 10 days. It was becoming clear that Diane controlled all communication with the board, acting as both prosecutor and judge in HOA matters. That weekend, I spotted a community flyer announcing a neighborhood barbecue at the Central Park. Perfect timing. An opportunity to meet more neighbors and perhaps identify potential allies on the board. The gathering was larger than I expected, with several dozen residents enjoying the late summer evening. I introduced myself to as many people as possible, bringing up HOA matters casually. "Oh, you're the guy with the suspicious car," said Ellen, a retired teacher from 2 streets over. Diane won't stop talking about it at our garden club meetings. A man named Marcus overheard and joined our conversation. "You live in the old Peterson place, right? Word is you're on Diane's special monitoring list." "Special monitoring list?" I asked. "She keeps track of problem residences," Ellen explained. "Been doing it for years. Anyone who questions her authority gets special attention." Marcus lowered his voice. "My brother-in-law was on that list." Diane had his car towed from his own driveway while he was on vacation, claimed it violated some 72-hour parking rule she made up. "Did he fight it?" I asked. "Tried to. Suddenly found himself hit with thousands in fines for everything from improper mulch color to unapproved bird feeder height. Ended up selling and moving." As the evening continued, I heard similar stories from at least 6 other residents, each involving selective enforcement, mysterious fines, and convenient interpretations of bylaws. What emerged was a clear pattern of abuse of power, with Diane at the center. I also noticed something telling. Board members were conspicuously absent from the community gathering. When I asked about this, a neighbor named Rachel explained they rarely attended public events anymore. "Diane's got them all intimidated or in her pocket," she whispered. The vice president tried standing up to her last year about the pool renovation budget. 2 weeks later, anonymous complaints about his home business got him investigated by the city, lost his permit and had to relocate his office. The picture growing clearer, I began documenting everything with the same methodical attention I'd give to a case file, photographing my property daily to disprove violations, recording dates and times of Diane's drive-bys, and starting a log of all interactions. I installed a discrete security camera system covering my driveway and front yard. If this escalated further, evidence would be my best protection. The following Tuesday night, my captain called with an urgent update on our narcotics case. A confidential informant had provided information requiring immediate action. I rushed out, leaving my car in the driveway where it had already been parked for 3 days during my rare stretch of time off. The operation ran longer than expected, nearly 36 hours of continuous work, as we tracked key players and coordinated with adjacent jurisdictions. By the time I headed home, I was running on coffee and adrenaline, my thoughts focused on a shower and sleep. I turned onto my street at dawn, mind already drifting toward my bed. It took several seconds for my exhaustion-fogged brain to process what I was seeing, or rather what I wasn't seeing. My driveway was empty, my car was gone. For a moment, I sat in my rideshare completely still, staring at the empty driveway where my car should have been. Exhaustion instantly evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and focus. 8 years in narcotics had conditioned me to snap into full alertness at the first sign of trouble. I paid the driver and approached my property cautiously, scanning for any signs of disturbance. Nothing else appeared missing or damaged. This wasn't random theft. This was targeted. Unlocking my front door, I went straight to my security system and pulled up the previous day's footage. There it was, timestamp 9:17 a.m., a tow truck pulling into my driveway with professional efficiency. The driver hooked up my unmarked Charger, while another figure supervised from the curb. I zoomed in. Diane Hartwell stood watching, arms crossed, a satisfied smile playing across her lips as my vehicle was hauled away. My jaw clenched. This wasn't just HOA harassment anymore. This was theft. More critically, my service weapon was secured in The lockbox under my seat and case files were in the trunk. While both were properly locked and secured according to department protocol, having sensitive materials in a towed vehicle created serious professional complications. I picked up my phone and called dispatch. "This is Officer Reeves, badge number 4723. I need to report my unmarked unit has been towed from my residence without authorization." While dispatch ran the information, I continued reviewing the security footage. The tow truck had Premier Towing emblazoned on its door, a company I recognized from previous police interactions. "Reeves," my watch commander's voice came through. "We've located your vehicle at Premier Towing on Industrial Boulevard. Do you need a unit to respond?" "Negative," I replied. "I'll handle it personally." I ordered another rideshare and spent the 15-minute drive reviewing relevant vehicle codes and HOA statutes on my phone. By the time we pulled into the towing company's lot, I had confirmed what I already suspected. Even if the HOA had towing authority for community roads, which they did, they had absolutely no legal right to remove a vehicle from a private driveway without the homeowner's consent. The impound lot was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Beyond it, I could see my Charger parked among dozens of other vehicles. I approached the small office where a heavy-set man in his 50s sat behind a counter. "Morning," he greeted without looking up. "Retrieval fee is $275 plus $50 per day storage, cash or credit." "I'm here about the black Dodge Charger brought in yesterday morning from Oak Ridge Estates," I said, keeping my tone neutral. Now he looked up, recognition dawning on his face. "Oh yeah, the abandoned vehicle. HOA called it in, said it had been left for over 3 days, violating their 72-hour rule. That vehicle was parked in my private driveway, not on HOA property," I replied, "and I'm going to need to see the authorization paperwork." The man frowned. "Look, buddy, we just pick 'em up where we're told. If you've got a problem with the Josie," I placed my badge on the counter. "Detective Michael Reeves, Metro Narcotics, that's my unmarked police vehicle, and I need to see the authorization paperwork now." His face paled. "Police vehicle. Nobody said anything about that." "The paperwork," I repeated. He fumbled through a filing cabinet, eventually producing a towing authorization form. It was signed by Diane Hartwell, citing abandoned vehicle and community safety concerns as the justification. Most importantly, it fraudulently claimed the vehicle was parked on HOA common property. "I'll need copies of everything," I said, "and I'll also need to know how often you tow from Oak Ridge Estates." The impound manager's nervous demeanor told me everything. "Mrs. Hartwell calls us quite a bit, probably 3-4 times a month, always says it's authorized by their bylaws." "And you never verify?" I asked. He shrugged uncomfortably. "She's got the official forms. Not our job to question an HOA president." I took out my phone and photographed the document. "I'll also need access to my vehicle immediately. It contains police equipment and sensitive materials." "Of course, officer," he stammered, suddenly helpful. "No charge, obviously. Had we known—" "I'll still need a record of the standard fees," I interrupted, "for my report." As he prepared the paperwork, I noticed a familiar name on the authorization form under HOA. Towing Liaison, Richard Hartwell. "Diane Hartwell's husband works with your company?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. The manager shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Hartwell is our business relations manager, handles all our contracts with HOAs, apartment complexes, that sort of thing." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just harassment, it was a profitable family business. Diane flags the vehicles, her husband's company tows them, and homeowners pay hundreds to get their cars back. A neat little racket. Once outside, I inspected my vehicle thoroughly. Everything appeared undisturbed, my weapon and case files secure. I placed a quick call to my captain explaining the situation. "Jesus, Reeves," he said after I finished, "this HOA president had your service vehicle towed without authorization while you were on active duty." "Yes, sir, and preliminary evidence suggests she's running a towing scheme with her husband's company." A low whistle came through the phone. "Document everything. I'll notify internal affairs since department equipment was involved, but this sounds like something you might want to take to white-collar crimes." "Not yet," I replied. I'd like to handle this personally first. After ending the call, I sat in my recovered vehicle, thinking through next steps. This was no longer about petty HOA tyranny. This was potential criminal fraud, abuse of power, and theft. If Diane was targeting other residents the same way, this could be a significant pattern of illegal activity hiding behind HOA authority. As I drove home, I noticed Diane's Mercedes parked in her driveway. She stood watering plants, watching as I pulled in. Rather than confront her immediately, I simply parked, nodded politely in her direction, and went inside. Let her wonder why her plan had failed so quickly. Let her worry about what would come next. Because one thing was certain, Diane Hartwell had just towed the wrong car belonging to the wrong person. And unlike her previous victims, I wouldn't be intimidated into moving away. I was just getting started. The next morning, I approached this situation the way I would any narcotics case, methodically, patiently, and with careful attention to detail. I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh legal pad, mapping out what I knew and what I needed to discover. First, I called my colleague Sergeant Martinez from the department's Legal Affairs Office. "So your HOA president towed your unmarked unit from your private driveway?" Martinez asked after I explained the situation. "That's ballsy. And potentially criminal," I added. "I need to understand exactly where HOA authority ends and illegal activity begins. I'll send you the relevant statutes, but the short version is clear. No HOA can remove a vehicle from a private driveway without owner consent unless they've obtained a court order, which is extremely rare. Even for community roads, they need proper signage and documentation." This confirmed what I suspected. Diane had overstepped her legal authority, likely multiple times with multiple residents. "What about the conflict of interest with her husband's towing company?" I asked. "That's a separate issue. Could be fraud, especially if she's hiding the relationship from the board or residents. You should check your HOA bylaws for conflict of interest provisions." After ending the call, I pulled up Oak Ridge Estates governing documents. Sure enough, Article 7 clearly stated, board members must disclose any financial interest in vendors providing services to the association and recuse themselves from related decisions. I doubted Diane had been recusing herself from towing authorizations that benefited her husband's company. Next step, canvassing the neighborhood. Just like working a case, I needed witness statements and corroborating evidence. I started with Tom next door, showing him photos of the tow truck taking my car. "That's the third vehicle I've seen them take this month," he confirmed. "Did you know about their little family business?" "I'm putting the pieces together," I replied. "Has anyone else mentioned having their vehicle towed?" Tom nodded grimly. "The Pattersons down the street, the Rodriguez family on Maple Court, and Dr. Wilson on the corner. All for supposed violations that seemed manufactured." Over the next few hours, I visited each neighbor Tom mentioned. Their stories followed a pattern. Diane would issue warnings about vehicles, often citing rules that didn't exist, then have the cars towed with little or no notice. Each homeowner paid hundreds in fees to retrieve their vehicles. None knew that Diane's husband worked for the towing company. Dr. Wilson, a retired surgeon, was particularly helpful. "I've lived here 15 years since before Diane became president," he explained. "The towing problem started exactly when her husband Richard took that job with Premier Towing 3 years ago. Have you raised concerns at board meetings?" I asked. "Tried once," he sighed. "Diane said towing was a security measure to protect the community from suspicious vehicles. When I pressed further, my questions were ruled out of order, and I started receiving violation notices weekly. By mid-afternoon, I had statements from 7 different homeowners who'd had vehicles towed from their private property. I also discovered the towing company charged the HOA a reduced rate for patrol services, essentially paying Premier to drive through the neighborhood looking for violations. I needed more concrete evidence of the financial relationship, so I called an old academy friend who now worked in financial crimes. "County records and business filings are public information," she advised. "Look up their business license, check property records, see if they're filing jointly." Following her advice, I spent the next few hours digging through public databases. The results were illuminating. Richard Hartwell wasn't just an employee of Premier Towing. County business records showed he owned a 40% stake in the company. More damning still, the HOA's annual financial report listed parking enforcement services as a $36,000 yearly expense paid to Premier. This wasn't just a conflict of interest. It was a steady income stream funneled from homeowner dues to the Hartwells' pockets. I also installed 2 additional security cameras covering my entire property, including one with a clear view of the street. If Diane decided to escalate further, I wanted irrefutable evidence. That evening, I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board requesting an emergency meeting. I cited the illegal towing from my private property, included references to relevant statutes, and formally requested all documents relating to the HOA's contract with Premier Towing. I sent copies to every board member individually by certified mail, ensuring Diane couldn't intercept or dismiss them. As I placed the letters in my mailbox, I noticed Diane watching from her window again. This time, I didn't just nod politely. I held her gaze steadily, letting her see that I wasn't intimidated. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across her face before she let the curtain fall. She still didn't know I was a police officer. She still thought I was just another homeowner she could bully into submission. But that illusion was about to shatter, and her carefully constructed kingdom with it. The investigation had officially begun. The Oak Ridge Estates Community Center looked more like an upscale country club than a meeting space for a suburban HOA. Vaulted ceilings, stone fireplace, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the neighborhood pond, all maintained by the considerable monthly dues collected from residents. By 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the emergency meeting, the room was already packed. Word had spread quickly after my certified letters reached the board members. Homeowners who had suffered under Diane's regime for years sensed blood in the water and turned out in unprecedented numbers. I deliberately arrived last, timing my entrance for maximum impact. Instead of my usual casual attire, I wore my full police uniform, dark blue with badge gleaming, service weapon holstered at my hip. The department had authorized this. After reviewing the illegal towing incident and potential fraud allegations, a hush fell over the room as I entered. Diane stood at the podium arranging papers, her back to the door. It was only when the whispers reached her that she turned, her expression shifting from annoyance to shock as she took in my uniform. "Officer," she stammered, clearly struggling to reconcile the problem resident with the law enforcement officer now standing before her. "Detective Michael Reeves, Metro Police Narcotics Division," I stated clearly, my voice carrying through the now silent room. "Homeowner at 1823 Oak Ridge Drive. My vehicle was illegally removed from my private property last week." The board members, seated at the table, exchanged nervous glances. Richard Hartwell, seated in the audience, went pale. Diane quickly tried to regain control. "Detective Reeves, while we appreciate your service, this meeting has a set agenda and protocol. The emergency meeting was called to address the illegal towing of my vehicle and the apparent conflict of interest regarding Premier Towing." I interrupted, approaching the front of the room. "As the aggrieved party who called for this meeting, I believe I have the floor first." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Diane looked to the other board members for support, but they avoided her gaze. "Very well," she said tightly. "You have 5 minutes per our bylaws." I placed my evidence folder on the podium and began methodically laying out the facts. The unauthorized towing from private property, the security footage showing Diane supervising, the removal, the documentation proving Richard Hartwell's ownership stake in Premier Towing, and the HOA's $36,000 annual contract with the company. This represents not only a violation of state property laws, but potentially criminal fraud through undisclosed self-dealing, I concluded. The HOA has been paying substantial sums to a company partially owned by Mrs. Hartwell's husband, apparently without proper disclosure or recusal. The room erupted. Residents began shouting questions and sharing their own towing stories. One elderly resident stood up shakily. "They towed my grandson's car from my driveway while he was visiting me in the hospital," she said, voice quavering with anger. "I had to pay $325 to get it back." Others joined in, each story more outrageous than the last. Diane banged her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. "These accusations are ridiculous," she finally shouted above the din. "The board has always known about Richard's employment. Ownership," I corrected. 40% ownership according to county records. "And everything was properly disclosed," she continued, ignoring me. "Premier Towing provides essential services to maintain our community standards. Detective Reeves is simply upset that his suspicious vehicle was appropriately removed after numerous warnings. My unmarked police vehicle was parked in my private driveway," I replied calmly. "The HOA has no legal authority to remove vehicles from private property without owner consent or court order. So I've distributed copies of the relevant statutes to the board." Richard Hartwell suddenly stood. "This is nothing but harassment. You're abusing your police authority to intimidate us." The accusation hung in the air for a moment before I responded. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm here as a homeowner whose property was illegally taken. The fact that I'm also a police officer doesn't change the laws your wife violated." I turned back to the board. "I've prepared a formal complaint with supporting evidence. I'm requesting immediate termination of the contract with Premier Towing, reimbursement for all homeowners whose vehicles were illegally removed from private property, and a full financial audit of HOA expenditures." The vice president, a thin man named Alan who had previously remained silent, finally spoke. "Given the serious nature of these allegations, I move that we suspend the towing contract pending investigation and schedule a special vote regarding Mrs. Hartwell's continued role as president." "Seconded," another board member quickly added. Diane's face flushed with anger. "You can't possibly, this is completely out of order. The board can't remove an elected president without proper procedure." Alan calmly opened the HOA bylaws. Article J Section 7 allows for emergency suspension of officers when allegations of financial impropriety arise. We can hold a formal removal vote after investigation. Diane looked around the room, seemingly realizing for the first time how completely she had lost control. Her gaze hardened as it landed back on me. "This meeting is adjourned," she declared, slamming her gavel down and gathering her papers. "We'll reconvene when cooler heads prevail." As she stormed toward the exit, the vice president spoke again. "The meeting is not adjourned. As acting chair, I call for an immediate vote on suspending the towing contract and initiating an audit." The vote was unanimous among the remaining board members. Diane and Richard Hartwell watched from the doorway, their expressions a mixture of shock and fury, before departing abruptly. After the meeting, residents gathered around me, sharing information and contact details. A neighborhood alliance was forming, united against years of Diane's tyranny. As I walked to my car that evening, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. Diane and Richard, sitting in their Mercedes across the parking lot, watching me intently. Instead of driving away, they followed at a distance as I headed home. That night, around 2 a.m., my security system alerted me to movement near my property line. The camera footage showed two figures prowling along the edge of my yard, flashlights sweeping across my house. Though they stayed just off my property, their intentions were clear: intimidation. I recognized Richard's distinctive silhouette instantly. The Hartwells were escalating, not retreating. They'd lost the first battle, but were clearly not ready to surrender the war. The next morning, I called my captain and requested a formal meeting. This neighborhood dispute had crossed a line that demanded official police attention. I arrived at work the next morning to find my captain waiting with an unusual expression, part concern, part curiosity. "Reeves, you've got a situation," he said, gesturing me into his office. "The department received 3 separate complaints about you this morning, all anonymous, all claiming you're using your position to harass residents in your neighborhood." I wasn't surprised. "Let me guess, they mentioned my HOA? Specifically mentioned your intimidation at a community meeting." He handed me copies of the complaints. "Care to explain why you're suddenly at war with suburbia?" I laid out the entire situation: the targeted harassment, illegal towing, financial self-dealing, and the Hartwells' nighttime prowling around my property. "So they didn't know you were a cop until you showed up in uniform?" The captain leaned back, a hint of amusement breaking through his professional demeanor. No, sir. I think that's what has them panicking. He nodded thoughtfully. I'll dismiss these complaints as retaliatory, but keep this clean, Reeves. Document everything. If they're committing actual crimes, build a case like you would any other. No shortcuts, because this is personal. Understood, Captain. As I left his office, my phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor, Tom. Warning, Diane. Going door to door with petition against you. Claims you threatened her. The counterattack had begun. When I returned home that evening, my mailbox was stuffed with new violation notices, each more absurd than the last. According to Diane, my grass was 1 to 4 inches too tall. My mailbox was an unapproved shade of black, and my front door wreath constituted an unauthorized decoration. The most ridiculous, a notice claiming my home security cameras violated neighbors' privacy, demanding their immediate removal. I documented each notice, adding them to my growing evidence file. Then I called the department's legal team to review my options. The HOA does have some authority over external home features, the department attorney explained, but security cameras for personal protection are generally protected, especially for law enforcement officers. As for the other violations, they appear to be selective enforcement which violates fair housing laws. Armed with this information, I decided to expand my investigation. I contacted our department's financial crimes specialist, Detective Sarah Winters. I need advice on investigating potential HOA fraud, I explained. I'm handling this as a private citizen, but I want to make sure I'm building a proper case. HOA fraud is surprisingly common, Sarah replied. Start with the money trail. Requester. Financial records for the past 3 years, and look for patterns of self-dealing or misappropriation. Follow vendors, especially ones receiving regular payments. I submitted a formal request to the HOA board for complete financial records. The Vice President, Alan, now aware of the seriousness of the situation, agreed to provide them despite Diane's objections. While waiting for those documents, I decided to connect with other homeowners who might have insights. Judge Robert Keller, retired from the County Circuit Court, lived at the end of my street. His legal expertise could prove invaluable. I've been watching Diane's reign of terror for years, the judge said when I visited his home. Always suspected something wasn't right with that towing arrangement. Have you noticed other financial irregularities? I asked. The judge nodded. The landscaping contract doubled 2 years ago when they switched to premium landscapes. Coincidentally, a company incorporated by Diane's sister. Another potential conflict of interest. I added it to my notes. There's also an attorney who lives on Maple Court, he continued. Patricia Gonzalez, specializes in real estate law. She's been collecting evidence of selective enforcement for months. By the end of the week, I had connected with both Patricia and several other concerned homeowners. We formed a small working group dedicated to reviewing HOA practices and documenting violations of law and bylaws. Meanwhile, Diane's harassment campaign intensified. Anonymous calls to the precinct continued. Flyers appeared on mailboxes, warning about a rogue police officer in the neighborhood. My recycling bin mysteriously disappeared, followed by a violation notice for improper waste management. The pettiness was almost comical until I discovered what happened to the Rodriguez family. Carlos Rodriguez approached me as I was checking my mail. Detective, they're targeting anyone who spoke at the meeting. My son's basketball hoop, approved 3 years ago, suddenly violates HOA rules, $100 daily fine until it's removed. Similar reports came from other residents who had supported me. Diane was retaliating broadly, trying to isolate me by punishing my allies. I advised everyone to document everything and not to pay any fines until our investigation was complete. Patricia Gonzalez offered to send cease and desist letters to the HOA board regarding the retaliatory actions. The financial records finally arrived, and our working group spent a weekend analyzing them. The results were damning. Beyond the towing contract and landscaping issues, we discovered administrative fees paid to a consulting company owned by Diane inflated maintenance costs with no competitive bidding. Unexplained transfers from the reserve fund to operating accounts. Personal expenses, including Diane's cell phone, charged to the home most concerning, was the pattern of selective enforcement in fine collection. Residents who opposed Diane paid thousands in fines, while her allies had similar violations ignored. We were preparing to present our findings when disaster struck. My phone rang at 3 a.m. Tom's panicked voice on the line. They're towing cars. They're up and down the street. At least 6 so far. Diane's with them, claiming it's an emergency enforcement action. I dressed quickly and headed outside. Sure enough, Premier Towing was loading Mrs. Wilson's sedan onto a flatbed while Diane supervised, clipboard in hand. When she spotted me approaching, she merely smiled. "Special enforcement authorized by board emergency powers," she announced smugly. "Any vehicles with expired registration tabs, even by 1 day, are being removed." I checked Mrs. Wilson's car. Her registration sticker had indeed expired yesterday. "You're selectively enforcing minor violations as retaliation," I stated calmly, taking photos with my phone. "Just maintaining community standards, Detective." As we spoke, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When I checked it, my blood ran cold. Backed up wrong people. Narcotics officers have enemies. Be careful which cars you approach in dark parking lots. I looked up at Diane, who was watching my reaction with an odd expression. "Something wrong, Detective?" she asked with false concern. I didn't answer, instead taking a screenshot of the threatening text. This wasn't just HOA bullying anymore. This was a threat against a police officer potentially connected to my narcotics work. The Hartwells had just crossed a very serious line. As the tow truck pulled away with Mrs. Wilson's car, I made 2 calls. One to Captain Rivera requesting an official investigation, and another to the county prosecutor's office. Diane had just transformed a neighborhood dispute into a criminal matter, and she had no idea what she had unleashed. Captain Rivera didn't take half measures. By noon the following day, the department had assigned Detective Lisa Hammond from Financial Crimes to officially investigate the threatening text and potential fraud connected to the HOA operations. "We're treating the threat against you as a separate matter from the HOA issues," Hammond explained, as we sat in my living room. "But if they're connected, the evidence will show it." The threatening text had elevated everything. What might have remained a civil dispute was now a criminal investigation with the full resources of the department behind it. "I need everything you've gathered so far," Hammond said. "Financial records, witness statements, security footage, all of it." I handed over my meticulously organized evidence files. "The latest development is this mass towing operation they conducted at 3 a.m. selectively enforced expired registrations by a single day." Hammond raised an eyebrow. "After being instructed to suspend the towing contract?" "Exactly." Diane claimed emergency powers authorized her to override the board's decision. While Hammond reviewed my files, I received a call from Alan, the HOA vice president. "Diane called an emergency board meeting without notifying me or the other members who voted against her," he reported, voice tight with anger. "Apparently got her allies together and pushed through a resolution reinstating the towing contract. Under security emergency provisions." "Is that even allowed under your bylaws?" I asked. "Not without notifying all board members. It's completely invalid, but that didn't stop her." The abuse of power was becoming more blatant as Diane grew desperate. She was making mistakes, critical ones that strengthened our case. Hammond looked up from the financial documents. "This is textbook self-dealing. The towing contract alone would justify criminal charges, but these other vendors..." She flipped through pages of transactions. Premium Landscapes, Oak Ridge Consulting, Hartwell Property Services, all connected. To the Hartwells or their family members? "That's what our research indicates," I confirmed. She nodded, expression grim. "I'm going to request subpoenas for their bank records. If HOA funds were diverted for personal use, that's felony embezzlement." By the end of the day, the investigation had expanded significantly. Hammond arranged for forensic accountants to analyze the HOA's financial history, while another detective interviewed residents who'd experienced retaliatory enforcement. Meanwhile, I focused on the threat. Our tech unit traced the text to a burner phone purchased at a convenience store near Richard Hartwell's office. The store's security camera showed a figure in a hooded jacket buying the phone with cash, face carefully turned away from the camera. Not definitive proof, but another piece of the puzzle. The following morning, I had an unexpected visitor, Margaret Winters, the HOA treasurer for the past 8 years who had conspicuously missed recent meetings. "I've been wanting to come forward," she said nervously, clutching a laptop bag. "But Diane, she can be very intimidating." "You're doing the right thing, Mrs. Winters," I assured her. "Whatever information you have could help a lot of residents who've been harmed." "I've kept my own records," she explained, removing a flash drive from her bag. Diane doctored the official books, but I tracked everything separately. I knew something wasn't right. The flash drive contained a gold mine, original invoices, unaltered financial statements, emails from Diane instructing Margaret to reclassify certain expenses. Most damning was a spreadsheet tracking what Diane called enforcement revenue, targeted at specific residents who had opposed her at meetings. "She kept a list of problem residents," Margaret explained. "Anyone who questioned her authority would suddenly receive violation notices until they either paid up or moved out." "Why didn't you report this sooner?" I asked gently. Margaret's eyes welled with tears. "My husband has been ill. Diane knew about his medical bills and hinted that crossing her would result in losing my position and our health insurance. I arranged for Hammond to take Margaret's official statement. The treasurer's records provided the documentary evidence we needed to move forward with serious charges. Later that afternoon, I received another breakthrough. Patricia Gonzalez, the attorney who lived in the neighborhood, called with news. "I just heard from a former board member who moved away last year," she said. "Jason Chen. He claims he was forced off the board after questioning the towing contract. Says he has emails from Diane explicitly threatening him." "Can he forward those emails to us?" I asked. "Already done. I've copied Detective Hammond." "Michael, these are explicit." Diane wrote, and I quote, "If you continue pushing this towing issue, Richard and I will ensure your family regrets it. Remember, your children walk home alone from the bus stop." I felt a chill. This wasn't just financial impropriety. This was systematic intimidation and threats. Hammond called an hour later. "We've got enough for search warrants. Judge is signing." Them now, Diane and Richard's home, their personal office, and the HOA records. "What about Premier Towing?" I asked. "That too. We're hitting all locations simultaneously tomorrow morning." I spent that evening reviewing everything we'd gathered. The case had grown from a simple towing dispute to a complex investigation involving fraud, embezzlement, criminal threats, and misuse of HOA authority. As I organized the timeline of events, my phone buzzed with a text. I tensed, expecting another threat, but it was from my neighbor Tom. "Diane and Richard loading files into their car right now, lots of boxes." I immediately called Hammond. "The Hartwells are moving documents from their house, possible evidence destruction." "I'll expedite the warrants," she replied. "Stay clear of them, Reeves. You're too close to this case already." I agreed, but continued watching through my security cameras as the Hartwells made multiple trips between their house and car, loading what appeared to be file boxes and computer equipment. Just as I was about to call Hammond with an update, my phone chimed with an incoming text. This time it wasn't a neighbor. "Back off now or everyone learns about your disciplinary hearing from 2018. Even good narcotics cops have secrets." I froze. In 2018, I'd been investigated after a drug bust went sideways. I was cleared of wrongdoing, but the internal hearing had been stressful. Only department personnel would know about that. Moments later, another text arrived. This one? From Richard Hartwell's actual phone number. "Sorry about that. That last message was meant for someone else." Awkward. I stared at my phone in disbelief. Richard had just made a catastrophic mistake, sending a threatening message, realizing he'd used his real number instead of the burner phone, then trying to cover with an absurd excuse. I immediately called Hammond and forwarded her the messages. "Did he seriously?" Her voice trailed off. "This is the break we needed. The threat explicitly connects to your police work. We'll move on the warrants tonight." 3 hours later, I watched from my window as police vehicles converged on the Hartwells' home. Officers emerged with boxes of documents, computers, and phones. Diane stood in her driveway in a bathrobe, arms folded, face contorted with rage. As they placed Richard in a police car, the threatening text providing probable cause for his immediate arrest, She caught sight of me watching. Her expression changed from anger to something more dangerous, a cold, calculating hatred that sent a clear message: this isn't over. But the evidence mounting against them told a different story. For the Hartwells, the end was closer than they could possibly realize. The morning after Richard Hartwell's arrest, Oak Ridge Estates hummed with activity unlike anything the quiet suburban community had ever seen. Police vehicles lined the streets. Officers in windbreakers labeled Financial Crimes Division carried boxes of evidence from the HOA office. The local news van had arrived, setting up across from Diane's house. I watched it all unfold from a professional distance, following Captain Rivera's strict instructions to stay uninvolved in the official investigation. "You're the victim and a witness now, not the investigating officer," he had reminded me. "Let Hammond and her team handle this." Detective Hammond had assembled a task force specifically for what they were now calling Operation HOA. The scope had expanded well beyond my personal situation, revealing a pattern of fraud and intimidation affecting dozens of homeowners across multiple communities where the Hartwells had influence. By mid-morning, neighbors gathered in small clusters on their front lawns, watching and discussing the events in hushed tones. Many approached me with questions I couldn't fully answer. "Is it true they found shredded documents in their fireplace?" asked Mrs. Rodriguez. "Are they really charging her with racketeering?" wondered another neighbor. I offered the same response to everyone. "The investigation is ongoing. Let's give the detectives space to do their work properly." Around noon, Hammond called me to the HOA office where she'd established a temporary command post. "Thought you'd want to see this," she said, gesturing to a leather-bound notebook laid open on the conference table. The pages contained handwritten lists of residents categorized as compliant, problematic, and most disturbing, targets for removal. My name appeared at the top of the latter list, with detailed notes about my work schedule, vehicle, and daily routines. "She was tracking your movements," Hammond explained. "We found calendars noting when you left home, when you returned, even which lights were on in your house at night." A chill ran through me. "That goes beyond HOA harassment. Way beyond. This is stalking, Reeves, and there's more." She flipped to another page showing financial calculations. They were planning to place liens on targeted homes based on fabricated violations, then foreclose when the fines accumulated. Could they actually do that? With enough fabricated paperwork and their connections, they might have succeeded with some residents. They were playing a long game. The evidence Hammond's team uncovered painted a picture far darker than simple abuse of HOA power. The Hartwells had been systematically targeting homeowners who opposed them, using a combination of legitimate HOA mechanisms and outright fraud to either extract money or force them out. Beyond the towing scheme, they had created a shell company that charged for landscaping services never performed, diverted funds from the community reserve account to personal use, falsified meeting minutes to approve, expenditures never actually voted on, used HOA attorney fees, paid from community funds for personal legal matters. As the day progressed, a crowd gathered outside the community center. Hammond decided to hold an impromptu public briefing to address residents' concerns and prevent misinformation from spreading. "At this time, we are executing search warrants related to financial crimes involving your homeowners association," she announced to the assembled neighbors. "Richard Hartwell has been arrested for making criminal threats against a police officer, and the investigation has revealed evidence of numerous additional offenses." A murmur ran through the crowd. "While we can't share specific details of an ongoing investigation, we believe many homeowners may have been victims of fraudulent practices. We're setting up a dedicated hotline for anyone who believes they've been wrongfully fined or had property improperly towed." As Hammond spoke, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the edge of the crowd. Diane emerged, face contorted with rage. "This is harassment," she shouted, pushing through the onlookers. "You have no right to spread lies about me or the HOA." Hammond remained completely composed. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is an official police investigation based on substantial evidence. I suggest you contact your attorney immediately." "I am calling my attorney, and the mayor, and the police commissioner." Diane's voice rose to a shriek. Do you know who we know in this city? This neighborhood would be nothing without me. The outburst continued until two officers gently but firmly escorted her away from the crowd. As they guided her back to her vehicle, Diane spotted me standing near the community center entrance. "You," she spat. "You think you've won? This isn't. It's over. We built this community. We control everything." Her public meltdown was captured by the news cameras, her threats clearly audible. By evening, the footage was playing on local news stations, paired with serious-faced anchors discussing alleged HOA fraud scheme. Later that afternoon, the HOA board called an emergency session. Without Diane present, they voted unanimously to remove her as president pending the criminal investigation. Alan was appointed interim president, with a mandate to cooperate fully with authorities and begin rebuilding trust with homeowners. Hammond called me that evening with an update. "We found offshore accounts," she said without preamble. "The Hartwells have been moving substantial sums, well beyond what they could explain with their legitimate income." "How much are we talking about?" "Initial estimate is close to $2 million over the past 5 years. They've been running this scheme across multiple HOA communities, not just Oak Ridge. Richard's towing company had contracts with 6 different associations, all with similar patterns of selective enforcement and kickbacks. The scale was staggering. What had begun as petty harassment over my parked car had unraveled a criminal enterprise hiding behind suburban respectability. The following morning brought another development. Patricia Gonzalez called me, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "Michael, we found something in the HOA bylaws. The version Diane has been enforcing isn't the legally recorded version. She's been working with an altered document that gives the president powers never actually approved by homeowners." This explained how Diane had justified so many actions that seemed beyond HOA authority. She'd literally changed the rules, counting on no one checking the official records. By the end of the week, the district attorney's office announced formal charges against both Hartwells: fraud, embezzlement, falsifying business records, criminal threats, and conspiracy. Richard remained in custody, while Diane had been arrested at her sister's home in a neighboring county, where she'd fled after her public meltdown. The DA held a press conference outlining the charges, specifically highlighting the exploitation of homeowners through fraudulent fines and unauthorized towing. "This case represents one of the most extensive HOA fraud schemes we've encountered," the prosecutor explained. "The defendants used their positions of trust to systematically target homeowners and extract funds through illegitimate means." As cameras flashed, I watched from the back of the room, still processing how a simple dispute over my parked car had exposed years of corruption and abuse of power. Later that evening, residents organized an impromptu gathering at the community center. What began as an information session evolved into something cathartic, neighbors sharing stories of Diane's tyranny, comparing outrageous violation notices, and expressing relief that the reign of terror had ended. Alan, the interim president, presented a vision for rebuilding: transparent finances, reasonable enforcement, and community input on all major decisions. The HOA should serve homeowners, not control them, he said to enthusiastic applause. "We've lived under a distorted version of what community governance should be. Today, we start fresh." As I walked home under a sky sprinkled with stars, I reflected on the incredible turn of events. Diane and Richard had believed their power absolute, their system foolproof. They never imagined that towing one particular car, belonging to a narcotics detective with investigation skills and an instinctive response to bullying, would bring their entire operation crashing down. My phone buzzed with a text from Hammond. "Diane's talking, offering information on associates in exchange for consideration. This is going to get bigger." The reckoning had only just begun. 3 months after the Hartwells' arrest, Oak Ridge Estates had transformed. The summer heat had given way to crisp autumn air, and the neighborhood itself had undergone an equally refreshing change. I stood in my driveway on a Saturday morning, washing my unmarked police charger, the vehicle that had inadvertently triggered this entire saga. The irony wasn't lost on me that I could now park it wherever I wanted, without fear of mysterious violation notices or pre-dawn towing. "Looking good, detective," called Tom from across the street, raising his coffee mug in greeting. "The car or the neighborhood?" I asked with a smile. "Both, definitely both." He wasn't wrong. Under Alan's interim leadership, the HOA had undergone a complete restructuring. The old board had resigned en masse, replaced through special elections, with homeowners who promised transparency and reasonable governance. Patricia Gonzalez, the attorney who had helped uncover the bylaws discrepancy, now served as vice president. Their first official act had been to schedule a complete forensic audit of HOA finances going back 5 years. The results had been sobering, nearly $2.4 million misappropriated across multiple communities where the Hartwells had influence. The second act had been to dramatically reduce monthly dues and eliminate most of the arbitrary restrictions Diane had implemented. Reasonable standards remained to maintain property values, but gone were the excessive fines and selective enforcement. As I finished drying my car, a notification appeared on my phone, a reminder for today's court hearing. The Hartwell case had worked its way through the legal system with surprising efficiency, driven by overwhelming evidence and the district attorney's determination to make an example of HOA fraud. I changed into a suit and drove downtown to the county courthouse. The building's imposing stone facade seemed a fitting backdrop for the conclusion of this neighborhood drama-turned-criminal case. Inside, I found several familiar faces from Oak Ridge Estates already seated in the gallery. Mrs. Wilson gave me a warm smile and patted the empty seat beside her. "Wouldn't miss this for the world," she whispered as I sat down. "After what they charged me to get my car back from that impound lot, I want to see justice served." The courtroom filled quickly, not just with Oak Ridge residents, but with homeowners from 5 other communities where the Hartwells had operated. Their scheme had been remarkably consistent across all locations: gain control of the HOA board, alter bylaws to expand presidential powers, establish contracts with family-owned service providers, and systematically harass anyone who questioned their authority. At precisely 10 a.m., the bailiff called the court to order. The Hartwells entered separately, each flanked by attorneys. Diane had lost the imperious posture that once defined her, her designer clothes replaced by a modest suit, her expression subdued. Richard looked similarly deflated, his former confidence erased by months of legal proceedings and mounting evidence. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with steel-gray hair, reviewed the plea agreement the prosecution had reached with the defense. "The defendants have agreed to plead guilty to 14 counts including fraud, embezzlement, criminal conspiracy, and making threats against a peace officer," she summarized. "In exchange for their cooperation in ongoing investigations against associated parties, the prosecution has agreed to recommend sentences at the lower end of the statutory range." The cooperation element explained the relatively quick resolution. The Hartwells, facing overwhelming evidence and lengthy prison terms, had provided information about others involved in their scheme, including a county clerk who had helped alter property records and a banker who had facilitated their offshore accounts. After confirming the defendants understood the agreement, the judge addressed the victims seated in the gallery. "Before I accept this plea and move to sentencing, I want to acknowledge the harm done to the numerous homeowners affected by these crimes. What occurred here was not simply financial fraud, but an abuse of community trust and governance." She then invited victim impact statements. 3 homeowners spoke eloquently about the stress, financial hardship, and sense of powerlessness the Hartwells had inflicted. Mrs. Rodriguez described how her family had nearly lost their home due to fabricated violations and excessive fines. When my turn came, I approached the podium in plain clothes rather than my uniform, speaking as a homeowner rather than a police officer. "Your Honor, the defendants didn't just steal money. They stole people's sense of security and belonging in their own homes. A community should be a place where people feel safe, not a fiefdom ruled through intimidation and fear." After all statements concluded, the judge announced her decision to accept the plea agreement. The Hartwells were sentenced to 58 months in federal prison, ordered to pay $2.4 million in restitution to affected homeowners, and barred from serving in any HOA or community governance position for life. As the bailiff led them away, Diane glanced back at the gallery. Our eyes met briefly, and in that moment I saw something I hadn't expected. Not hatred or defiance, but a flicker of shame, quickly masked by resignation. She had finally recognized the damage she had caused in pursuit of power and control. Outside the courthouse, homeowners gathered on the steps, sharing a collective sense of closure. Alan approached me with Patricia and several other Oak Ridge residents. "We've drafted completely new bylaws," he explained, showing me a document on his tablet. "Checks and balances throughout, term limits for all positions, and full financial transparency. We'd like your input before the community vote next month." "I'm honored," I replied, "but I'm actually thinking about stepping back from HOA matters for a while." Patricia smiled understandingly. "After everything you've been through, that's completely fair, but your experience would be invaluable in creating safeguards against this ever happening again." I promised to review the draft, appreciating that they wanted my perspective rather than my control, the exact opposite approach of the previous regime. The following weekend, Oak Ridge Estates held its first community-wide gathering in years, a block party celebrating both the neighborhood's fresh start and the official end of the Hartwell case. Streets were closed to traffic, grills were fired up, and children played freely without fear of arbitrary rule enforcement. As sunset painted the sky in vivid orange and pink, I sat on my front porch with a cold drink, watching neighbors chatting and laughing together. Tom wandered over with a plate of barbecue. "Hard to believe this is the same neighborhood from 3 months ago," he remarked. "Remember how people used to scurry inside when they saw Diane coming?" I nodded. Amazing what happens when fear is replaced with actual community. "You know," Tom said thoughtfully, "when you moved in, I warned you about Diane, never imagining you'd be the one to finally end her reign of terror." "I was just defending my right to park in my own driveway," I replied with a smile. "The rest was just good police work." "Well, the neighborhood owes you a debt of gratitude. Though I'm still curious, why didn't you just tell Diane you were a cop from the beginning? Might have saved you some headaches." I considered the question. "In my experience, people show you who they really are when they think you're powerless. Diane saw a new homeowner she could bully, not a detective she should avoid. Her mistake was assuming a badge was the only source of power worth respecting." As the evening continued, I found myself in conversation with neighbors I'd never really known before the Hartwell situation. We talked about ordinary things, home renovation plans, favorite local restaurants, recommendations for reliable plumbers, the kind of casual community building that had been impossible under Diane's divisive leadership. Later, as residents began drifting home, Alan raised a toast to new beginnings and properly parked cars, bringing laughter and a final round of applause. Walking back to my house, I noticed a for sale sign being installed at the Hartwell's former residence. Their property had been seized as part of the restitution agreement, with proceeds to be distributed among victims of their scheme. Inside my home, I glanced at the folder labeled HOA Correspondence, sitting on my desk, once filled with violation, notices and threats, now containing the draft of new bylaws focused on homeowner rights and reasonable governance. I opened my kitchen drawer and pulled out the original citation Diane had left on my door about my suspicious vehicle. It seemed like years ago rather than months. I smiled at the irony of it all, how her obsession with my car had ultimately revealed the full extent of her corruption. The next morning, I parked my unmarked police charger in my driveway, just as I had that first day in the neighborhood. But this time, as I walked toward my front door, neighbors waved and called friendly greetings. No clipboard-wielding figures watched from behind curtains. No violation notices awaited me. Just the simple pleasure of coming home to a community where I belonged. Some battles aren't chosen, but find you anyway. What had begun as a simple defense of my right to park on my own property had evolved into something far more significant. The restoration of a neighborhood where rules existed to support residents, not control them. As I unlocked my door, I glanced back at my properly parked, completely unremarkable, absolutely violation-free police car and smiled. Some parking spots, it turned out, were worth fighting for.